All right, welcome to chapter number 4. This is video number 3. We are going to talk about slavery today, slavery in the South, and we're going to do guided reading questions 6 through 9. So we're going to talk about things like what slave life in the Chesapeake versus the lower South is going to look like. What are some of the challenges of slave families? What is the difference in French Louisiana? We're going to talk about slavery there. And then why is that different from the British colonies of the South? And then we're going to talk about ways that slaves rebelled. Some were, very obvious. Some were a little more subtle. We'll talk about that as we kind of get to the end of the video. Now let's talk a little bit about the differences between slavery in the Chesapeake versus the lower South. We're going to begin in the lower South, where one of the major characteristics is larger plantations. Larger plantations mean larger tracts of land, meaning they needed more forced labor. Hence, larger plantations are defined as 50 or more slaves. So in the lower South, like in South Carolina, where they had these gigantic rice plantations, we're going to see more slavery per plantation, per farm. 50 or more generally is the kind of unwritten rule. There's going to be a little bit of a shift in where slavery comes from. As we kind of move on, remember we talked about in the 1600s, we started off with indentured servants that came over from Europe, and gradually they switched to moving towards African slaves. Now we're going to see a little bit of a transition where in the early part of the 1700s, we still have a lot of African slaves. But those initial African slaves got together, had children, so there is a half kind of American-born slave, half African slave population within each plantation, which is going to create an interesting dynamic, I suppose. In the lower South, there's an infrequent contact with the white population, and really there's an infrequent contact with the master of the plantation. Usually a slave would only see like the white slave driver. That's about all that they had contact with on a daily basis. Now in the lower South, in those rice plantations, man, it was hard labor. They had just tons of tasks like stopping the flow of water so they could get the right amount of water in the rice fields. It was just a lot of tough, hard work. Now they adopted something called a task system in the lower South, meaning like instead of just having like group labor, you would have like a task that you were given every day as a slave. And said once you have completed that task, you are complete with your day's work. Now, that might sound good on its surface, like all I have to do is finish this one thing. That one thing, let me assure you, isn't something you're gonna be finished with in 20 minutes or an hour or even like 3 hours. It's gonna be a major. You're gonna get a day's worth of work that you have to do, which is again probably hard work. Okay, so that is kind of the difference between, that is the characteristics of the lower South. Now, the Chesapeake Valley is a little different. They also have many African-born slaves as well as American-born slaves. They have a lower population on each plantation, like 20 or less slaves generally, just not quite as labor-intensive, so they have a smaller amount of slaves on each plantation. Those slaves had more contact with the white world. They also, the owners of the plantations more actively managed that slave plantation, so they had more contact with their slave masters, so to speak. Now there is an interesting dynamic in the slave communities among American-born and African-born slaves. Obviously, the first one that jumps out at you would be just the difficulty in communicating between American-born slaves who know English and African slaves that do not speak English. The problem with the African slaves were they didn't even speak maybe the same dialect because they came from different tribes in Africa. So you might have a number of African slaves that can't really communicate with each other as well, which made for a problematic situation. There was also a little bit of competition among slaves. During the early part of the 1700s, men outnumbered women about 2 to 1. So when looking for a mate, men kind of were competing with one another. And this was a little bit of animosity between the two groups. Obviously, like if you fancied a woman, did I say fancy a woman? What am I, 80? If If you liked a woman, then obviously there was competition because with the other males on the plantation. American-born slaves tended to have the advantage because they could speak English, so communicating was a little easier. Again, which created a little bit of resentment between the two groups. Now let's talk a little bit about the slave communities. Early in the 1700s, like you said, it was a little bit of a competitive place. There was some animosity, some contention. As we move into the 1700s, there's less and less slaves from Africa that are kind of brought over, because the birth rate among slaves just naturally kind of increases the slave population on its own. They don't need to import slaves from Africa at such a rate. This also evens out the male-female ratio, so there isn't that kind of competition for love. So that kind of calms things down within the slave community. The slave community could be a real reassuring force. Because they did have, at least in the recent past, African slaves, it reconnects them with their African roots, like religion, folk tales, songs, things to kind of bring them some enjoyment in a pretty rough life. So that slave community was essential. If somebody were to move out of the community, maybe kids and things would be looked after. They'd move in with other slaves on the plantation. Okay, so slave community was pretty important. Now, slave families. Let's talk a little bit about slave families. Slaves were allowed to marry on the plantation, so that was, again, something that gave them a little bit of enjoyment. They could establish a family life, which created some happiness. Now, there is some problems with that. There are definitely some problems, some challenges that kind of come about with having a family on the plantation. The first one, and I think this is one that really is not talked about enough. I know people focus on like how hard people had to work and the physical abuse, which again were all terrible, terrible things. More physical kind of torture than anything else. This is a little bit more emotional torture, in that slave families could be sold, they could be broken up. And I think people kind of skip over how frequently this really did happen. So what I mean by that is if a slave gets married, that slave could get sold, so always separated from his wife and kids, or the kids could get sold out. So I'm like, hey, I have 4 kids, and I come back, and all of a sudden the kids have been sold off, or my wife got sold off, whatever the case may be. Families were split up by being sold. So that was and it could happen in the blink of an eye. So it was pretty traumatic. I know people think about like, hey, I have a family member that moved across the country. We're separated too. But remember, slaves aren't free people. They can't just say like, I'm taking a vacation day and I'm going to go a couple towns over and see, my family that got sold off. Like that didn't really happen. So a lot of times when you had those families separated, that meant like you may never see those people again. That was a really rough thing. There's kind of a story kind of told about this at the end of slavery. There is, obviously, people went out into the world. If I was married as a slave, you kind of went out in the world. And there's kind of stories of slaves kind of running into like an ex-wife or an ex-husband that got sold off, and they're just like, well, I'm never going to see them again, and they remarried. And now it's like, ooh, I have 2 wives or two husbands. You had to make a choice. Again, so it kind of like demonstrates what was going on and how easily your family could be torn apart. A rough one. Now, not only does it have to be sold, like if the owner dies, in his will, oftentimes that owner would leave the slaves that he owned to family members. And that didn't always go, like all the slaves didn't go to one person always. Sometimes they did. But the slaves could definitely be broken up that way, saying, my, one kid gets, these 4 slaves, my other kid gets these 10 slaves, whatever. So they could break them up according to their heirs. Sometimes men were hired out to go work at other farms. Now this is only like a temporary thing, but if you're not seeing your father for a whole summer, that's a pretty rough way to go. So men were hired out, and sometimes they had to work on other plantations, and sometimes they were forced to move. Plantations moved from seaboard cities to the interior. Over the course of the 1700s, about a third of the slave population actually is going to see their movement. Okay. All right, the French also had slaves in North America. Now, we talked about the French having colonies within like Canada, so somewhere up around kind of the New York, the Maine, kind of right around there. They had forts. They move into like the Ohio Valley. Um, Eventually, they trickle down to like Mississippi and like Louisiana, and they see the way the British are kind of ruling their southern colonies, how slavery has kind of made its way in, and they are convinced to bring slavery to Louisiana. Now, this does not go as well as it does in the colonies from an economic standpoint. The French eventually stop importing slaves, and it really is because of a big slave revolt, the Natchez Rebellion. And that's when a bunch of slaves, the French brought in more slaves actually than there were white French people. So they bring in all of these slaves, they get together and they decide they want to rebel. They team up with the local Natchez tribe and they revolt against the French, kind of the French plantation owners. So when this is going on, obviously they kill about a tenth of the French population. The French in retaliation come back and they team with the Choctaw tribe and they eventually put an end to the rebellion. Now this makes an interesting dynamic. They stop importing slaves. They decide it's really not worth it. But they do still have slavery in Louisiana. Now they have greater movement among slaves. Slaves are encouraged to make their own goods and market and sell their own goods. Freedom is granted a little more liberally, like if you serve in the French militia and fighting against the British or Indian tribes, you're granted your freedom. So this kind of happens. It's not till cotton becomes a really valuable commodity that you're going to see like kind of big plantations take their shape in Louisiana. Now, last thing we're going to talk about is, last thing we are going to talk about is slave rebellions. Now, there's the obvious ways that slaves rebelled, and that's kind of we talked about with the French. There's an uprising of slaves kind of get together and decide they've had enough and fight for their freedom. This didn't happen super frequently within the British colonies. A few times in Virginia, a few times in South Carolina, where actually slaves outnumbered whites in South Carolina. Plantation owners were terrified this would happen, so they put provisions in place to stop it. So it doesn't happen very, very often. There is a pretty famous rebellion called the Stono Rebellion, where about 100 slaves kind of get together and overthrow kind of their master, and they don't get too far. Eventually, eventually the white militia comes in and puts down the rebellion and puts an end to it. So that's probably one of the more famous, the biggest one, pre-Revolutionary War time. But the fear of rebellions really, as much as anything that white plantation owners do, the fear of just knowing that they're probably not going to be successful limits kind of the number of slave rebellions that happen. So when we talk about slaves rebelling, it wasn't necessarily the violent overthrow of the plantation owners. A lot of it were a little bit more, were a little more subtle. Now, obviously, there's people trying to run away. That's a major form of rebellion, of just slaves trying to escape. There's countless slaves that kind of make its way through the Underground Railroad, which we're going to talk about later on in American history. So they try to do that. Some try to form what they call maroon communities, meaning like a lot of times African slaves will kind of get together in groups, and they're going to try to escape, and they kind of like disappear into the woods and form communities on their own. Obviously, the obvious problem with that is they're pretty easy to detect, these communities, so they by and large are not really very successful. More subtle things they could do as they live on the plantation were things like faking illnesses. So forcing somebody to work doesn't always mean forcing somebody to work their hardest. So they could fake illnesses. They could pretend like they didn't really know what exactly they were supposed to do, or again, just not work very hard. A lot of times slaves would break tools, kind of giving themselves momentary breaks until they get so they got new tools. They stole from some of the storehouses.